Hi, it's Brian Bennett, and I'm assuming because we're in the middle of fall here, I hope your fall's gotten off to a good start, that you're either coming out of a season of ministry planning or you're heading into a season of planning the ministry for the next year, or maybe the next 3, the next 5 years, depending on how you do your ministry planning. And I just want to share a key insight about how to be more effective in our ministry planning as we seek to fulfill God's mission that He's called for our church or parachurch ministry. And one of the things that's really helpful to think about, because many times what we do is we get a picture of the future in our ministry planning that, hey, this is the goal, this is where we believe we're headed to go. But what we don't do is take into account the environment around us as well. And we don't take time to slow down and to scan the environment and to read what's happening, much like a river guide, if you've ever been whitewater rafting, who knows that river really, really well and knows the currents and knows the rocks and where they need to position the raft to navigate the rapids. It's the same in ministry planning. So we know we want to go down the river. We know there's a destination we want to get to, but how we get there requires wise stewardship of the resources, of the people, of everything that God has entrusted to our responsibility and care. And so to do that, we have to know the currents of the river well to be faithful and effective stewards of the resources that God has entrusted to us. And so once we get that preferred picture of the future vision, that's the destination. But getting there, there's a lot of rapids along the way. And one of the tools that helps us be effective in planning and achieving those plans is scenario planning. And scenario just means you're developing a picture of the future and you're asking some key questions. And so here are 3 key scenarios that we should plan every time we're doing ministry planning is for us to read the environment, to scan the environment around us, inside and outside of the ministries that we lead. So we want to look internally, look at the people, look at the financial giving, look at the trends in participation and attendance and new people and baptism. We want to look at all those things. We also want to look externally. Look at what's happening in our community with the growth or the decline of the community, with new businesses moving in or moving out, with young families or retirees moving to our area. We also want to look broader than that on a national level. What's happening? One of the key trends that we should be watching and paying attention to is the possibility of the church losing its tax exempt status. Now, that may never happen. It may not have a huge effect if it does happen, but it could have a huge effect. Someone could argue at least that's possible and that could have a significant effect. So that's an example of a trend that's bigger than our community that could have a massive effect on the ministries that we lead. And so one of the things that's helpful is the scenario, hey, if that happens, what are the possibilities? And we want to think through 3 different possible scenarios, taking that as an example. What's a continued trajectory of the status quo? If things just continued into the future and the status quo, take that trajectory into the future, what would likely happen financially as we look into the future if the government took away the tax exempt status of the church? Well, you might look at that and say, I think based on where we are, this is what would happen. Based on the commitment of our givers and the biblical kind of surrender of where our body is, I think this is likely what would happen. Or you might look at your church and say, we have a lot of people who are giving, and I think I'm not sure if they would continue giving at the level they're at if you took tax exempt status away, because it would mean it's less in it for them from a tax refund, right, kind of perspective. Um, Kingdom perspective, they still can invest all those resources and return on investment, but there's less personal gain for them from a tax perspective. Now take another scenario. What if it went better? What if the government took the tax exempt status away, and let's just say we even gained money or we maintained? Maybe that's better for us in our perspective. What would be the factors that would lead us to gain or maintain if the government took our tax exempt status? Well, our people would be committed to the mission beyond what's in it for them, and our people would have a key understanding of what it means to make a kingdom difference in the world around us, and they'd be motivated around the mission, and they'd get stewardship principles and generosity, and they would be giving. Even though we lost tax exempt status, they would give at the same level or even give more sacrificially. All right, so thinking through those factors now says, okay, where are we at? If that's the possibility, where are we at today? We don't have a strong understanding of stewardship in our church. So over the next few years, we really need to invest in teaching and in enabling stewardship to be a core value of our body. And we need to even start preparing our people now for the possibility that the benefit of their income tax on that will be taken away. But here's the kingdom, and here's the why we give above and beyond, regardless of what the government gives us back. We need to start teaching more to that. That would be an example of taking that scenario, backtracking to here and saying, what do we need to do now for that particular scenario? The third scenario is a pessimistic scenario and just says, okay, let's just say we tried our best, and let's just say giving drops by, here's the possibility, it could drop by 15%. I don't know if that is a real possibility. I just made that number up. But let's just say that it dropped by 15%. Wow, that's going to be X amount of dollars from our budget. Now, where's that money going to come from? What are we going to do if that happens? And to think through now our staffing, to think through our budgets, to think through the ministry areas. And it doesn't mean we don't make hires. It doesn't mean we're not going after it. But it may mean for some of us that we start saving a little bit more. We put a little bit more back in our reserves because we don't want to be exposed if giving drops. For some of us, it may mean that we just go through scenario planning and we say, you know what, this would be the first ministry that we would have to let go. Here'd be the second ministry. And oh man, this one, if we have to get to this point, it means we're going to have to let go a leader of a ministry. And who do we have to let go if that comes to that? You know, nobody wants to plan that, but as the leaders of the church, to be ready for the future and to be effective of the future and discern now, to pray now, God, who are you calling us to be into the future? Who are you calling us to be as a church? And man, if we had unlimited resources, we'd want to keep this ministry. But if push comes to shove and we don't have the resources and it's not something we can do without the resources, then we're going to have to let these three ministries stop doing their ministry. We can't have to defund them. We all have to make choices. We have to make choices every day of who God's calling us to be as his people, what he's calling us to do as his particular people in this particular context. And thinking through scenarios is a discernment tool that we can use as we prayerfully discern the future and just look at it from different angles and say, okay, I think these are the top 5 trends. Let's take each one of these trends. If it's a positive, if it's just a continuation of where we are from now, how we think it's going to affect it. If it's worse than we would like, what would that look like? And just think through that now. And here's the benefit of doing this, of planning and using scenarios as part of that and developing those. So we don't just have a preferred picture of the future, but we have a really rooted preferred picture of the future that we're holding in faith as we're going with the Lord into his mission for what he has for us. But we're rooted in that as we're following him. Here's a couple benefits of that. The first one is awareness. It's too easy for us in the hustle and bustle of ministry and all the different good things that are happening around us to stop looking at the environment around us and to get inward focused. And we've all driven by a church that was a big church somewhere, but it's falling apart. Or there's a tiny, it's a massive church at one point, but it's holding on with a small group of people who are really just prolonging the inevitable. They're going to shut the doors of this. And we always say, how does that church get there? Well, it got there because at some point it took its eyes off of the world around it, and it got comfortable and it looked inward and it just played it safe. And that's a real danger. So one of the opportunities of scenario planning, one of the benefits is that it raises our eyes off of ourselves and takes us into the environment around us, and it moves us into the future and says, okay, God, where you're leading us, what does this look like, right? If our population of our church is declining, it's easy to kind of hope it gets better. It's easy to even pray it gets better. But if it's not getting better and we're praying and we're hoping, then God might be calling us to do some things and to take some action to see that it gets better and to preach on God's mission and engage people in God's mission in fresh ways and engage leaders in the church in God's mission in fresh ways. And so there may be actions that we're going to have to take for that to happen, but awareness in scenario planning might help us get there. The second thing that scenario planning gives us is clarity. It's too easy to live with confliction between we kind of want everything. We want everyone to be happy. We want to do every program, every single ministry, to not make hard choices. Scenario planning helps us get to a point where we're having to look at choices and saying, okay, if this happens, then this happens. Here's where we are. How are we going to respond? What are we going to do? When it comes down to this, let's just say we had an extra $200,000 in the next 2 years. What would we do with that money? Let's just say we had $200,000 less in the next 2 years. What are we going to do then? Right? And just thinking through that, God, what are you calling us to do? Who are you calling us to be? How can we faithfully live out the mission, knowing that we don't control the future? God's sovereign over the future. We're not worried about it, but we're stewarding the resources he's given us so that we can be faithful with the calling that we've been called into. It's all about stewardship. The third thing is preparation, and this is where stewardship comes into play. When we look at the future, and let's just go back to the money example, and we say, hey, look, we think it's likely that the tax exempt stance is going to be lost in the church, or we think it's likely, when streaming, the ability to stream live first came on, all kinds of opportunity. And there were people who were early into that because they were paying attention to that trend. But there's all kinds of opportunity for missions, for training of leaders, for building into your people, for reaching people who are far from God. And there's all kinds of opportunities that those who are paying attention to that trend and felt like that's what God was inviting them into, that jumped on that early. And there's going to be more opportunities to come as translation technology continues to develop at a rapid pace, and streaming. There'll be a day where it'll be easy to stream your service with and people will be able to watch in live translation rapidly, and it'll make the possibility of the good news of Christ going forth around the world with increasing speed and reach. And if you want to be prepared for that, it's obviously paying attention to those trends in translation technology and those trends in streaming. It's way easier than it used to be to stream. So going back to the money, if we look in the future and say, hey, here's where we think what could happen when it comes to nonprofit status. Backtrack. Okay, now what do we have to do today to have us as a body be ready for that real possibility? If you say, hey, I only think it's a 10% possibility, I don't think it's very likely, you might not place a lot of emphasis on it. But I think it's very likely that that could happen. So what do we need to do today to get ready for tomorrow? How do we need to be preparing our people today to be a missional people tomorrow, to be a generous people tomorrow, to be a multicultural people tomorrow who have those values, to be racial reconcilers tomorrow, whatever it is? How do we need to be preparing today for tomorrow based on where God is leading us? So as you're doing your ministry planning, as you look to the future, I would encourage you to block some time as a part of that. Come up with, hey, what are the top 5 factors that are influencing us externally in our environment, both locally and globally? What are the top 5 factors within that are influencing the mission? And then from there, develop some scenarios around those. Have some good dialogue. Even if it doesn't change your plan, the awareness will be helpful for the team. It'll keep you on your toes and discerning with God what He has for you. It'll keep you mission focused, and it'll keep you contextually sound as you're seeking to faithfully and courageously and spiritly filled live out the mission that God has called you into. So my prayer for us is that we would be faithful into the future. I think there's all kinds of opportunity in the midst of the challenges that the church faces in the new world that exists. But for us, there's all kinds of opportunity as God's missionary people. So may we go with Him into the world for His glory and for the good of others.